Hi, how are you? Hi, Frank. Hi, Professor
Good to see you.
Lopez. Hi, Xietong.
Hi.
It's wonderful. It's awful. I'm wearing mask. You're not wearing mask.
Yeah.
But anyhow, the Minister Chong Seok-lee, he was a former Minister of Unification. Now he's at the Sejong Institute. And we'll be having our Congressman, National Assemblyman Han-jung Kim, shortly, within 10 minutes. He had a session at the National Assembly. Now he's rushing from the Yeouido to Shilla Hotel. Anyhow, today we have 1 hour and 30 minutes, okay? And my plan is that I will allocate 10 minutes each, okay, for your presentation. The order will be the same, but since National Assemblyman Kim Han-jung will be late, and we'll start with Minister Lee, okay, that will be followed by Frank, you'll be doing it, and then Xietong, and then finally Professor Lopez, okay? And then I will ask National Assemblyman Kim Han-jung to give a 10-minute presentation. And we are now doing virtual conference, and I'll be getting comments and questions virtually. And then I will relay those questions and comments to you. However, after your presentation, I'll be asking some questions to all of you. And then we'll be collecting all the comments and questions from the different audience. And then I'll be relaying those comments and questions to you. Okay, with that one, let me invite Minister Lee to give a talk. 마이크 없어요. 요거 그냥 하면
예. 예, 반갑습니다.
Yes, it is a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for inviting me to this very important gathering. I'm delighted to be here. Are we starting now in earnest? Or so 10 minutes, yes? Should I just begin freely? Well, so if I were to begin, I know that for this session we're talking about different conflict resolution examples and see how they can be applied to the case here on the Korean Peninsula. We're trying to see the potential for application of those other conflict resolution cases here on the Korean Peninsula. This 1953 armistice agreement that was signed in July of 1953 is still present to this day. But a lot of the clauses in the armistice agreement itself are not being implemented fully. That is why we're living in a state of instability, and there is antagonism between North and South Korea, which has been in place for about 70 years, about 67 years or so. And also, as a direct result of the armistice, there is mistrust not just between the two Koreas, but between DPRK and the U.S. And this mistrust is not easing. It's actually getting worse. And I think that has ultimately led to the nuclear armament of DPRK. Now, this conflict here on the Korean Peninsula and the escalating conflict, escalating tension is really complex in nature. And so when we take a look at other regions or other countries around the world and the examples of conflict resolution, in those cases, I don't know if they can be directly applied to Korean Peninsula. It will be very challenging to do so because on the Korean Peninsula, this tension, we have to get rid of this antagonism. If we take a look at the other many hostile cases around the world, when we take a look at countries that have had a peace agreement signed after a war, there's Vietnam in 1974, and the Paris Peace Accords, for example, and the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty in the Middle East. Those can be some examples that we can cite. But for the case of Paris Peace Accords, that led to the what happened in Vietnam and the rise of communism in Vietnam, and the Middle East, Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty did not ultimately lead to peace in the Middle East. So can we directly apply them to the Korean Peninsula? What kind of implications do they have for the Korean Peninsula? I think that they obviously can bring partial implications to us, but fundamentally, when we take a look at the level of hostility in the Korean Peninsula, I don't think that they can provide us with conclusive answer for the Korean Peninsula. The North Korean nuclear issue, there were many different paths for us to take. And in the early 90s, we did what we took the Ukrainian approach, where Ukraine was led to give up its nuclear arms. Many big great nations, including Russia, provide a security guarantee and a regime guarantee and also economic supports. And then there was a Libyan model between the U.S. as well. But with Ukraine, although they were guaranteed regime security, they were attacked by Russia. There was civil war. And with Libya, you know what happened there. The U.S. said that they're going to provide regime security, but NATO forces attacked Libya, and Gaddafi and his forces ultimately lost the war. So there were not many opportunities that we could provide to North Korea. If you take a look at these international conflict resolution cases, I don't think that they would have conclusive implications. Rather, the implications that we can get is probably to take a look at these cases, see how they failed, and take lessons learned from those cases. What can we do to not fail in our case, and what can we do to do better going forward? So if I were to take a look at the situation on the Korean Peninsula, the DPRK and Republic of Korea are the actual interested stakeholders here who are in this actual territory of the Korean Peninsula. The two parties have to have a similar level of hope and desire for peace, and we have to have a similar level of thinking about what we ultimately want out of a peace agreement. So, in the past, major powers would provide unilateral guarantees to certain nations, or major powers would provide unilateral peace agreements. This means that the countries involved, the actual parties involved, were not able to find a way to make sure that these guarantees would stand. That is why, when we take a look at these international conflict resolution cases, I think that the implication that we can get is that the actual parties involved, by that I mean the actual countries living in the land that has been divided. So in our case, the DPRK and Republic of Korea have to have a common perspective and a common vision. Unless we have that, we will find it very hard to solve this issue of the division of the Korean Peninsula. Are you finished, sir? That was only been 5 minutes. Well, but then I'm waiting for questions.
But he gave in a very general remarks. But he's very good at discussions. Therefore, we will expect that he would come up with much more forwarding ideas while we're having discussions. Okay, now National Assemblyman Han-jung Kim is here. Let us give a big applause to him. It's a blessing for latecomer.
반갑습니다.
In fact, I just forget to introduce all of you, because I just forget the audience on the virtual line, But Mr. Han-jung Kim, he was a private secretary to President Kim Dae-jung. Therefore, he's one of the closest, aides to President Kim Dae-jung. And also he studied at Rutgers University, State University of New Jersey. And also he's now second-term member of National Assemblyman. He's also co-chair of a Committee on Korea Peace Forum at the National Assembly. Therefore, he will present a lot of good ideas. By the way, I introduced Minister Jong Suk-lee. He was Deputy National Security Advisor to President Roh Moo-hyun, and then he became Minister of Unification. And he is one of the leading experts on North Korea. His study of Korea Workers' Party of North Korea is still classic in the field of North Korean studies. And Frank Jannuzi, all you all know, he worked at the Senate for a long time. And he worked with the Vice President, then Senator Joe Biden, and he's now President of Mansfield Foundation in Washington, D.C., and also Xietong, most well-known China scholar all over the world. He was designated one of the 100 best thinkers of the world by Time magazine, and he's known as very provocative. Okay, and now these days he's now defending moral realism, and he argues China will be better than the U.S. in terms of morality. But we can discuss on that issue later. And Professor Lopez is a professor emeritus at the University of Notre Dame, and he was sitting on the UN Security Council and the expert panel on North Korean sanctions. Therefore, he might have a lot of work to say. Therefore, I think the Ministry of Unification was able to assemble really great, experts on the issue of peace on the Korean Peninsula. Since, National Assemblyman Han-jung is here, why don't we ask him to give a presentation and to be followed by, let me give us order, okay, to be followed by Frank, and then Xietong, and Professor Lopez, you are the last, but not the least, okay? Okay. 우리 김한정 위원님께서 좀 발표하시죠. 네. 10분입니다. You'll have 10 minutes.
Professor Moon, thank you for the kind introduction of myself. I'm very grateful for this opportunity about how we're going to end the abnormal situation of the truce, armistice, and going to promote peace in the Korean Peninsula. Thank you for the Minister of Unification, Lee In-young. And I'm very glad to see you, even though it's online, Frank Jannuzi of Mansfield, and Professor Lopez of Notre Dame, and Yan Xietong of Tsinghua University. From now on, I'd like to deliver my thought in Korean language, Korean.
So the Korean War broke out 70 years ago. So this year marks the 70th anniversary of the start of the war. But we're still in a technical state of war. The war hasn't ended. It has just been suspended. It's been 20 years since the Inter-Korean Summit was held, a historical milestone. As a member of the Democratic Party, I was working as a chairperson of the special committee on the matters, and I've had the honor of attending various events to commemorate the summit. So the topic at hand is to bring the end of war declaration for the Korean Peninsula. We need to understand the rationale for the end of war declaration. In fact, there has been a lot of discussion so far, but what really matters at this point of time is how to actually achieve the end of war declaration, how to really move forward. That would be an important matter to consider. But in terms of the effectiveness of the end of war declaration and the rationale, and also for the need, there has been a lot of debate on whether we really need this. So I want to bring your thoughts as to why we need to have the end of war declaration. As you understand, in July 1953, the war, well, actually the fire ended. There was an agreement with the United Nations Commander-in-Chief, and there was an agreement between China and the DPRK and the UNC. However, the country that was under attack and was actually the victim was not able to take part in the armistice agreement. And ever since then, this unstable form of suspension has been going on, and there has been some discussion on bringing the end of war declaration, but we really didn't have a lot of official debate to that end. And at an international or at a national level, in 2006, there was an Inter-Korean summit that was held, and at the APEC summit, President Roh Moo-hyun, and with President George Bush, they had an summit, and they wanted to discuss the topic of the end of war declaration. In 2007, there was a second round out of an important summit that occurred between President Roh Moo-hyun and the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. And there was a declaration adopted on the 4th of October, and one of the emphasis that was placed from the declaration was the end of war declaration. If you look at the Article 4 of the declaration, the end of war declaration is to be pursued between the two Koreas in collaboration with relevant parties, which was not fully implemented. And only in 2018, so 10 years after the declaration, there was a third summit between the two Koreas. President Moon Jae-in and the North Korean, the new leader, Kim Jong-un, had a meeting in Panmunjom, and they adopted a declaration as a result of that meeting. And what we need to remember from this meeting is that in 2018, as they were celebrating the 65th anniversary of the Korean War, they then had an agreement to have the end of war declaration that they should move towards peace agreement. The ultimate goal is to have a permanent and durable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, the two Koreas and the United States, or with China, so among the four parties, that they would have a meeting to discuss this issue. And there was an agreement to that regard. And 2 months afterwards, in 2018, that was in June of 10th, they had the summit meeting for the first time between the North Korean leader and the American leader for the first time in history. That's the Singapore DPRK-US summit, as you may already have heard. And the declaring the end of war was an issue that was to be discussed between the two leaders. And the first clause of the declaration was to build a new relations between the DPRK and the United States, that they are going to make joint efforts to end the hostilities between the two countries, and that there will be a durable peace regime to be built on the Korean Peninsula. So there was a talk about the peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, and President Trump, after the summit, noted to the media that there would be an end of war declaration. And he said it with a sense of confidence. And afterwards, China as well also declared their support for the end of war declaration in an official statement. So in other words, in terms of end of war declaration, whether it is between the two Koreas or with relevant parties such as the United States and China, there wasn't any official opposition or appeal against that notion. And in the House of Representatives, in July of 2019, they passed the National Defense Authorization Act to call for the end of war declaration of the Korean Peninsula. And 42 representatives came together to table a motion for calling for the end of war on the Korean Peninsula. In Korea as well, 174 lawmakers of the National Assembly of Korea also came to propose for the resolution on the end of war declaration. So it seems that there aren't much oppositions to the end of war declaration, but how come we don't see much progress to that end? One might wonder, and whether it is really significant to pursue that end of war declaration. It means that it's a suspension of engagement. So if we move towards an end of war declaration, what effects can we really expect from it? One might wonder. There have been much discussions and arguments for that. Well, the end of war declaration in and of itself is a declaration. It is a political declaration. It is nevertheless very meaningful, and in terms of the effectiveness and direction, it is quite meaningful, and it is something to be discussed in detail. And among the concerned parties of the end of war declaration, whether it is 3 parties or 4 parties, I don't really think the number really matters here, because we want to have peace on the Korean Peninsula as an ultimate goal, and we want to ensure stability of Northeast Asia. If it is a big task for us, there's no reason for us to exclude China, and we shouldn't do that. Now, the problem would be the attitude that is undertaken by North Korea, because North Korea has called for end the war declaration. However, as a prerequisite, it will want to see an end to hostility and also to have a security guarantee for the regime. The end of declaration is related to pursuing denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula and to building peace on the Korean Peninsula. We believe that it is a prerequisite that we need to address before we take that road. So the end of declaration, in other words, is a very important gateway to peace agreement negotiations that is currently in stalemate. And it could serve as a starting point for that discussion. There are some issues that we need to consider. There's a strained relations between the two Koreas, and the relations between the U.S. and DPRK is also in a stalemate. And to restart the talk on the end of the war declaration negotiation, whether it is really proper and appropriate to do so at this point of time, there's a big question mark. But we need to have end the war declaration all the more because there's tension, because this is for peace. It serves peace, and it can facilitate denuclearization, and it could also bring stability to Northeast Asia. So there's no reason not to pursue the end of war declaration. Second, the North Korea implied that it could forgo nuclear program, but it is not making any actual progress. And since there's no progress in denuclearization, some may ask whether we really need to pursue the end of war declaration. It could actually use to their advantage for rationalizing their position on nuclear weapons development. I think it is valid in and of itself, but coming back to the issue of negotiation for the end of war declaration and the diplomatic efforts, I think they're all related with one another. So in other words, it's not about recognizing North Korea as a nuclear state, but because there's a nuclear issue that still remains, the end of war declaration is actually something that we would critically need in order to pursue denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. Whether giving recognition to North Korea as a nuclear state or not, that is not something that we need to discuss at this point of time. We need to recognize North Korea as a state. If we don't recognize the country as a state, then there's really no reason for us to pursue this talk in the first place. Some people may wonder that it could lead to withdrawal of the USFK from South Korea. But it really has nothing to do with the end of war declaration, because troop presence is related to the mutual defense treaty that was signed between the United States and South Korea back in 1953. It has no direct relations to the end of war declaration. It does not have any bearing on the security positions between the two countries. So coming back to this issue again, the biggest issue at hand is the effectiveness. Whether North Korea would be able to honor its words. Please be mindful of the time. And we have to make that into a more practical measure. And we have to take a proactive stance towards this issue. Thank you.
이상입니다.
Thank you.
Next is Frank. It's your time.
Thank you so much, Moon Chung-in. It's a pleasure to see you and an honor to appear on such a distinguished panel. I've listened very closely to the two previous presentations, and I want to commend both for their brevity and also for making some really salient points. I will try to follow their example. To me, the real question at hand on the Korean Peninsula in terms of the peace mechanisms is that we should not think of peace declarations, peace process, peace treaties as mutually exclusive instruments to end the Korean War. most likely bringing about a genuine peace on the Korean Peninsula will require all three: a process of peace and confidence building, at some point a declaratory posture of the states that the war in fact is at an end, and ideally at some point a treaty mechanism to formalize commitments and resolve remaining outstanding issues. What I want to caution against is in placing too much faith in any one of these three different pathways to peace. Peace is a process. It's not a moment in time. The United States ended the Vietnam War with the Paris Peace Accords in 1975. But it was not until 20 years later, on July 11th, 1995, that the United States reopened an embassy in Hanoi and assigned an ambassador, normalizing our diplomatic relations. And it was not for many years after that that the United States normalized economic relations with Vietnam. So we had a nice peace treaty, but for a long time, the two nations did not have diplomatic representation in each other's capitals and did not have normal economic relations. Conversely, we could declare an end to the Korean War tomorrow, but we would leave a lot of work yet to be done with respect to establishing normal diplomatic ties in terms of opening up communication and travel and commerce and sanctions relief. And as a former Senate aide, I'm obliged to say that a peace treaty would be the highest bar to get over, if only because in the United States you need 67 senators to agree to ratify such a treaty. And getting 67 senators to agree to almost anything is extremely difficult. So I'm not an attorney, but I want to urge our panel and our communities to think about peace with North Korea as more of a process than a moment in time. And that is why I have a little bit of skepticism, to be honest, about how we think about a peace declaration, unless that declaration is itself accompanied by some meaningful, functional steps between the parties or among the parties to begin the establishment of a peace mechanism or peace regime on the peninsula that will give life to the words on that piece of paper. We had a very nice statement from Jo Myung-nok and President Clinton, which really encapsulated the ambition of the two nations, the DPRK and the United States, to establish normal, peaceful relations. But as we all know, that piece of paper ultimately did not come to fruition. We signed the agreed framework with North Korea, and the agreed framework in its second article said that within 3 months, both sides should reduce barriers to trade and investment, including the restrictions on telecommunications and financial transactions. It pledged that both sides would open up liaison offices in the other nation's capital within 3 months, following resolution of consular and other technical issues. And as progress is made, the agreed framework said that the US and the DPRK would upgrade their bilateral relations to the ambassadorial level. But unfortunately, those commitments were never fulfilled. So I think it's important to focus at some point on the substance of the peace mechanism more than just the words. And I know that everyone in this hall does understand that. Finally, let me just ask a question, which I hope we can get into in our question and answer period. To me, one of the real tricky points about what pathway to peace we pursue on the peninsula has to do with which nation states are integral to that process. To me, it's the Korean Peninsula, which means that North Korea and South Korea are the two essential parties who must be at peace with one another and must forge a lasting, durable, sustainable peace mechanism with each other. But it's also a fact that China and the United States were parties to the Korean War, and we must be parties to the peace. And again, not being a lawyer, I cannot say that it's impossible to end the Korean War without getting a signature from an American president and a Chinese president. But I do believe that any peace that fails to exploit the commitment of neighboring states to help sustain the peace will be a fragile peace. And that what we should strive for is a peace mechanism that brings on the full-throated commitment from Washington and Beijing, and also, I will say, Tokyo and Moscow and the United Nations institutions to uphold that peace. And in the same way that witnesses at a wedding, in some weddings, pledge to uphold the couple in their commitments to one another, the United States, China, and also Japan and Russia need to affirm their support for any peace process and peace mechanism on the Korean Peninsula in order for it to be durable, lasting, and really meaningful. I don't have much more to add. I will say that there are certain things about the peace process which I believe are really crucial, and I'll just list them briefly. One is that at the end of the day, a peace must be comprehensive. We can discuss sequencing. Maybe you start with the words declaring an end, but at the end of the day, real peace must be comprehensive. No peace regime will address every issue, but the peace mechanism really needs to set in motion parallel action on trade, communications, diplomatic relations, and so on. Second, the peace mechanism, the peace process must be reciprocal. It takes two to tango. You cannot have one party more committed to the peace than the other. Third, the peace process must itself resolve some of the sources of conflict. So it's hard to have an enduring peace if you have a territorial dispute. It's hard to have an enduring peace if one side has nuclear weapons that threaten the other. Finally, we should be pragmatic. We should focus peace to deliver real benefits to the people on the Korean Peninsula. If the North Korean citizens, if the South Korean citizens don't see the fruit of peace, then their enthusiasm for it will also be greatly diminished. Thanks so much. I look forward to discussion and questions.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, Xietong, now it is your turn.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Well, I think I will discuss this issue from our experience with the Taiwan issue. And actually in 2005 and 2005, and then our president, Hu Jintao, had a meeting with the president of the KMT and Kuomintang from Taiwan. During that time, and Kuomintang is no longer ruling party. So it's very easy for the mainland China and the KMT to reach a joint communique and state that and prepare for a peace treaty across the Taiwan Strait. Well, it's easy to reach an agreement and for a peace treaty, but then what? It went nowhere, resulted in nothing. Why? I think there's two reasons. First, KMT cannot represent Taiwan. He's not a ruling party, right? That is a key issue. That means the party, the ruling power at the other side, at Taiwan, actually plays a crucial role. If the Taiwan ruling party do not agree with a peace treaty or end of war declaration, there's nothing will happen. So the same thing for my understanding about the peace treaty or the end of war declaration between DPRK and ROK. So North Korea is, use Frank's word, a substance player. If North Korea do not agree, no matter how much the other parties agree with that, it meaningless, right? So I think this is the first important thing. Second thing is that each side must recognize each other as states. Just now, Mr. Kim has said that if you even do not recognize the other side as a state, how can you reach a peace treaty? Actually, and for mainland China, we can never recognize Taiwan as a state, right? We cannot recognize it as a sovereignty state. Okay, now taking our experience on the peace treaty between mainland China and Taiwan, I will spend a few minutes on about the possible end of war declaration and the peace treaty between the DPRK and ROK. And there's, from my understanding, that's not that difficult for the North Korea to recognize the DPRK as a state, a sovereign state. So China, US certainly have no obstacle to do it. And so, seems to me, this is not an obstacle. It's not very difficult. But then, the second problem is that whether especially the ROK consider the requirement from the DPRK. Well, let's suppose that the DPRK's government can represent that country, and they can make any decision. But then I don't think they say they will agree with either peace treaty or end of the war declaration without any requirement. They must require for something. For them, they say, okay, we agree with your suggestion, what we can get. That means what South Korea can offer North Korea. I mean politically, not economically. And I know many people are concerned that, okay, if we give them money, we give them a lot of money, they will agree with our political requirements. My understanding, that's not true. And DPRK won't sacrifice the sovereignty, sacrifice their right to military rights and for economic interests. That won't be. So what most possibly for DPRK to attach as a condition to the end of war or peace treaty? My understanding is America's withdrawal. American military withdrawal from the Korean Peninsula. And for instance, when we reach an agreement with the US to normalize our relationship with the United States, and the very, very first requirements or condition is that American troops have to leave Taiwan. That's the very, very first station. Even today, and the Trump administration tried to upgrade the diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, and then still the US know that the most sensitive thing is that to send American troops back to Taiwan. So here, personally, I don't think North Korea will agree with any peace treaty or end of war declaration without Americans' promise to get troops out of the peninsula. Then the problem is to come to North Korea. So what's North Korea's attitude? Is that possible for North Korea to close the American military base? Seems to me, and just like Mr. Kim said, no. North Korea said, we do not want to link the two things together. That's totally two things. Separate them. Well, I think from the side of the North Korea, the ROK is very, very reasonable, understandable. But for DPRK said, okay, it said, then if you do not accept my requirements, will I agree with you on end of war, on the peace treaty? So I think there's a new situation. The confrontation between China and the U.S. will intensify, and it seems to me will getting worse and worse. And no matter who win the election in the U.S., and seems to me the competition will be intensified rather than to be reduced. So because the strategic competition between China and U.S. become so in the moving towards a negative direction, I think neither China nor the U.S. have very much interest involved in this issue. They said, okay, now North Korea and South Korea, no matter what agreement you reach, we will agree. From Chinese side, I think that there's no doubt. No matter what, anything, you can North Korea and South Korea, you can reach agreement, fine. For the U.S., I think they only different from China on only one issue. That's American military presence on Korean Peninsula. Except this issue, I think the U.S. will not involve in other agreements between the DPRK and the ROK. So now, seems to me now the ball is at the sides and between the North and the South instead of the outsiders. That's my comment. Chungyan, I'm over. That's okay.
You're finished?
Yeah.
So energetic presentation. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, shall I invite the Professor Lopez? You have 10 minutes, okay? Thank you.
Thank you. And my sincere thanks to the Korea Global Forum for Peace for inviting me to offer my own reflections at this very prestigious conference and this delightful panel of colleagues today. Because my colleagues have highlighted so many of the various dimensions of this intractable dispute between DPRK and the ROK, which have prevented a real resolution to the issue of a permanent end of the war, whether it be a declaration of peace or a full peace treaty. As a scholar of peace research and peace building, who in practice also was able to be part of UN attempts to control nuclear developments in North Korea, let me offer my observations on what might improve the chances for the prospects for peace on the peninsula. I want to argue today, in part because my other colleagues have argued so well, I want to argue that today the escalating tensions and missed opportunities of the past 5 years in particular must be addressed more creatively, more consistently, and especially with a new full-scale process and plan of achieving some form of peace declaration, maybe even including so much of the comprehensive dimension that Frank has urged us on. The dramatic increase in the nuclear capability of North Korea since 2015, both in real nuclear systems and in their delivery modes of missile technology, has meant that Kim Jong-un is, despite the diplomatic isolation and the economic bite of sanctions, he is really able to resist various negotiations, particularly either with Seoul or with Washington, more strongly than ever before. Whether it be in his bargaining with the Seoul regime or the multiple issues that divide the North and the South, or his now growing agenda with regard to the United States of denuclearization, Kim is really in an immovable position if we think about straight bargaining models. And complicating this is a hardened position, of course, in Washington, D.C., in which we see denuclearization as a prerequisite from arriving at new security agreements. However, I think I agree with the notion that the United States might leave to the North and the South certain declarations of peace on the own peninsula. I think the United States, particularly under the current administration, has taken a much harder stand on this. I also think that DPRK won't yield on its nuclear accomplishments in any way before there are major concessions, particularly from the United States, but also an entire new security relationship for them that they can use as a bargaining for denuclearization in many ways. So clearly with this intractable dimension, I believe we need new smart diplomacy in order to break this stark deadlock and very much paralyzing the prospects for a peace on the peninsula. The cornerstone of my approach is that first, Washington and Seoul need to have a new rapprochement driven by new understandings in Washington of the position of the South in trying to reach this peace declaration. I also believe that the United States needs to take a more consistent and thoughtful approach with its allies and with its declaration of who might be foes. There is no future of full positioning peace on the peninsula unless we have a better relationship with China, unless we have a working relationship with Japan, and certainly unless we don't be playing players in the region against one another. Now, I'm not trying to view this as some magical thinking that the six-party days could return or that progress on peace is meant on the basis of all states having all goodwill to one another. But rather, I believe that a strengthened U.S. relationship with Seoul and a cautious, careful, and cooperative relationship with China is part of the keys to where we ought to go. But then the United States needs to take the additional step to understand that beyond bilateralism, there's a concept of how we approach the region and include the region in which we are the outside actor and must be part of a regional solution. So the first order of business is clearly to declare, I think, on the part of the United States, that whatever gains may have been made in the high-level summit diplomacy of the past 3 years, their utility has come to an end, and that the United States would invite North Korea to return to the time when lower-level expert working groups would begin to hammer out differences between the United States and the North Koreans, which would also include many of the interests of our strong allies in Seoul. In fact, a successful set of working groups between the North Koreans and the United States would open up space for Seoul and Pyongyang to have their own dialogues and to move to more consistent dialogue that had the flavor of April 2018 to it rather than the time since. Secondly, I think that the United States engagement has to recognize that sanctions under the rubric of maximum pressure have failed. They failed not only in the denuclearization goals that the United States had, but it has also failed to improve any level of DPRK behavior, which the United States objects. So under those conditions, to ensure a major policy shift that would lead to more and more bargaining, the United States would need to understand a new process framework in which sanctions and sanctions concessions are part of incentivizing and can stimulate more movement towards peace and more cooperation, not only between ourselves and the North Koreans, but open up better spaces for peace between North and South. I believe the best idea, and it be seen by many as kind of wild, is for us to look back to almost 60 years ago and polish off an old framework for arms control that began to initiate in the 60s all the way through the late 70s between the United States and the Soviet Union, a degree of stability that might be America's contribution to what might be peace on the peninsula. This kind of interactive communication and action-reaction mechanism is called the Graduated and Reciprocated Initiatives and Tension Reduction. In English, it's known as the GRIT system. The GRIT framework works best in serious disagreements between long-term hostile parties and acknowledges that if you can agree at least to a slow baseline in which all sides see as their shared interest war avoidance and an openness to greater dialogue to settle basic disputes, with that particular cornerstone, you can establish new, early, unilateral concessions by one of the parties, which can provide new incentives to others to engage in a process. Here's the key: to move beyond the intractable disputes that we have, in which the United States is a strong party on the peninsula. GRIT would require the United States to begin to take leadership in a process of conflict de-escalation. I believe the time for that U.S. leadership has come. And as the lead nation in a GRIT strategy, the U.S. would first announce, and without ambiguity or with qualification, our commitment to achieve our goals with partners and with foes on the peninsula without resort to first strike or without resort to war. Even the idea of denuclearization will occur by the United States withholding any commitment to the use of force to achieve it. The U.S. would then demonstrate the seriousness of that declaration, calling on all states in the region to engage in a new summit in which we agree not so much to a new set of declarations of exactly what the peace contains, but a set of rules of how we get to the peace. This would be followed quickly with an invitation to Kim Jong-un to affirm that this process, wherever it would be one in which North Korea would directly engage. Recognizing the problems that all might be involved in this, GRIT still says, be firm about your unilateral approach, be firm about your commitment to a process. And whether it's the first move you make or the second, third, or fourth, the burden comes to the state which initiated it to continue to make some concessions and invite others to do the same. With regional partners, I believe we can engage in that kind of exchange and provide a momentum to well-conceived confidence-building measures that lead to major, focused, and fruitful negotiations. In many respects, the end of war declaration or a full peace could be the second or the third or the fourth or the fifth in this process. But a commitment to even 24 quid pro quo exchanges would move us forward in many ways. When President Kennedy suggested this in the United States as a means of arms control in the 1960s, he was subject to intense criticism. But when he put it as the foundation, it led to 15 years of stable relationships with the Soviets with regard to denuclearization. One of the dynamics that was the key to the Camp David Accords was this step-by-step quid pro quo approach, which began with the unilateral initiative of Anwar Sadat to make a trip to Jerusalem in 1977. I believe, in closing, that we are about to approach a time which is ripe for the development of a GRIT system in which a creative and newly consistent ROK and U.S. relationship can move this diplomatic paradigm forward and achieve the end of war that each of us seek. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Lopez. Okay, now the Minister Lee, now he's regretting now that because he gave a too short presentation, but after having listened to all your presentation, now he wanted to add to his earlier remarks. 자, 이 장관.
예,
Yes, Mr. Moon is obviously a very good moderator, and I thought that I would be given some opportunities to add to my earlier comments, which is why I tried to keep my comments short in the beginning. But I really wanted to speak out because of all the insight that the other speakers have given me. I have to say that I really agree with what has been said, but I just want to say one thing is that the end of war declaration or peace agreement, if we look at them from a logical point of view, the withdrawal of USFK should be sort of a basic precondition that even if DPRK says that, okay, we can do without it, but later on DPRK might ask for it again, so the USFK withdrawal should be a basic precondition. But I think that if we take a look at history, in June of 2000, when President Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il had that summit, at that 2000 summit, the issue of a withdrawal of U.S. troops from the Korean Peninsula was actually not something that was proposed by the DPRK. That is to say, U.S. and U.S. troops in the Korean Peninsula is not necessarily the biggest issue. DPRK said that if America acts as a peace arbitrator, then they will not oppose too much. And following that, Roh Moo-hyun and other subsequent presidents talking about end of war declarations with North Korea when South Korea and North Korean leaders, when it comes to the withdrawal of USFK troops from the Korean Peninsula, they thought that they would put that together with the end of war declaration. So I think that there is a consensus now that USFK withdrawal is going to go in tandem with any discussions that lead to end of war declaration. This is because that was important. The USFK issue was seen as important by all parties involved, and that I don't think is going to pose as an obstacle anymore in our path towards end of war declaration or a peace agreement. The end of war declaration, I think, is something that within a peace agreement, because with a peace agreement, we're actually talking about peace and sustained peace. So we don't necessarily need to have a separate end of war declaration. I think the general case in the past is that we would just have a peace agreement. You don't need a separate document calling for end of war. But however, on the Korean Peninsula, as you know, 67 years have passed under an armistice regime. So war is not over here on the Korean Peninsula, which is why we have that DMZ between the two Koreas, and the U.S. troops and the DPRK troops and the ROK troops have all of those weapons focused densely and concentrated in that DMZ region. So because we are in this conflict and antagonist situation, we don't know when we can have armed conflict. We don't know when we might erupt into war. So that is why in this current situation, because we don't want war ever to come again, it would be beneficial to have the two leaders of DPRK and the Republic of Korea to have an end of war declaration. That is why this issue came up in the first place. And as many people have already mentioned, the peace agreements and the end of war declaration would be very contingent on the commitment of all parties to carry it out. There needs to be commitment and trust among all the parties, and there needs to be a situation where there is an enhancement of peace. The situation has to be there for us to go naturally into end of war declaration. We can't just randomly sign an end of war declaration while there is still antagonism abounding on the Korean Peninsula. We have lived in an antagonism. We have lived in an armistice situation for 67 years. Very unstable, very dangerous situation for the two Koreas. We want to resolve this situation, and the end of war declaration can be a stepping stone for us to go into a peace agreement. In that regard, perhaps this document is necessary. The end of war declaration does have utility for the Korean people, but it is not something that is 100% necessary. We can still go to a peace agreement without an end of war declaration, because with the two Koreas, we do have the Panmunjom Declaration, or we have the joint declaration that was signed in Pyongyang. So the two Koreas have different pieces of documents and declarations and statements that are already there. We've already agreed on the institutionalization of some peace-building measures. And also for the US-DPRK summit, they did have some dialogue. They did talk about the need for a new sort of more peaceful relationship within US-DPRK and DPRK and ROK. With all of these different pieces of documents out there, if we can just implement those, then they can stand in for a possible end of war declaration. So we don't have to think of end of war declaration as the end all be all. However, what's important is that the two Koreas and the US leader, we need a commitment to fulfill the terms of the declarations that were signed among these different leaders. So what I want to add lastly is that the U.S. nuclear issue, the two inter-Korean conflict, to resolve this tension, what's important is that the two Koreas, they take agency and really think about why we need peace. What can we get from a peaceful regime? What are the interests that we can have? What can we achieve? That desire and that commitment should be there. And another thing is that for the U.S., we can talk about many different things about what the U.S. wants, but the U.S. thinks of the DPRK as an absolute evil. If you think of the counterpart as an absolute evil, that means that you think of yourself as an absolute good. So from the U.S., they think that their policies are always correct and absolute. But from an objective point of view, American policies tend to be very unilateral and one-sided in nature. And so the U.S. needs to see that the DPRK feels a very real threat coming from America, and They should understand what each other's concerns are, what each other's fears are, and share those fears and concerns together. If there are those actual real results, together with all of these different input from Russia and China and the surrounding nations, and if we can have a constructive peace process, even if we don't have an end-of-war document, end-of-war declaration, then we can still go towards a peace regime and a peace agreement.
의원님께서 우리 이종석 장관께
And Congressman Kim Han-jung, would you like to respond to that as well? It seems as if what you're doing was just made meaningless, according to what former Minister Lee said. I know that you're making a lot of efforts towards this goal. For the past 20 years or so, there has been a peace process for the Korean Peninsula. And looking back on those efforts over the last 20 years or so, there are issues to be overcome. I think we really need to do away with nihilism, fatalism. For example, these commitments between the leaders are really not meaningful because they're not to be fully implemented. So there's that skepticism. Now, there have been a lot of historical breakthroughs from the summit between the two Koreas and also between the United States and DPRK since the end of the war. It was actually the first time that the two leaders from the countries were able to meet and see eye to eye. The fact that these commitments are not fully implemented, well, that's a second issue, another issue to discuss. We cannot just unilaterally say that the agreement itself is really not meaningful. Well, we think that we will not be able to bring any substantive progress at all, especially from the point of the importance of the implementation of the commitments between the two leaders. We're here to talk about the end of war declaration, and I think the end of war declaration was agreed upon between the two leaders. It is really about how to implement the declaration, and I wanted to bring your attention to that fact once again. Of course, declaration is only a declaration, some people may say. And what significance does it really carry? Jong-seok Lee talked about mistrust and hostilities between the two sides. And without fundamentally resolving this issue, what declaration or what benefit any declaration would bring? It is whether the egg is first or the chicken first. We should not actually approach this issue from a dichotomic perspective, because we need to understand that there was an agreement between the leaders at a summit level. There was no opposition to that agreement. The commonality that we see in the agreement is the end of war declaration. So we need to work to implement the declaration. We need to continue to put pressure on implementing the spirit of the declaration. And the end of war declaration is to end hostilities between the relevant parties, but it is not going to be a guarantee to that. But we really shouldn't be saying that a declaration itself is not needed at all. It is an overstretch to say that. Now, I know that many of you have been raising the issue about the U.S. forces in Korea. The troops' presence really means two things, because it's contributing to the balancing on the Korean Peninsula, and it could serve as a threat to North Korea. Especially looking at the relations between the United States and China, I think it could really be a burden on the part of China at the same time. But especially in terms of looking at the peace on the Korean Peninsula, I think North Korea could raise an issue against the USFK presence in Korea, because they're basically saying that unless we address the issue of USFK, they're not going to come to the negotiating table. And they have been maintaining the position for a very long time. And North Korea, I believe, and Kim Jong-un really wants to have an improved relations with the United States. So in terms of improving its relations with the United States, and through which it can seek security guarantee and to end hostilities with the United States. Against that backdrop, USFK presence, is it really becoming an obstacle on that journey? We need to pay attention to that. because the United States is now trying to see whether it wants to reduce its burden sharing on the Korean Peninsula. And I don't think that the end of war declaration would actually serve as an obstacle to USFK presence in Korea.
Question from, the nature of question is very straightforward. Does the United States want peace on the Korean Peninsula? A lot of Americans are concerned that if there is an end of war declaration or a peace treaty between North and South or between U.S. and DPRK, then there will be eventual withdrawal of American forces from South Korea and also dissolution of the United Nations Command. What is your take on that question?
Are you asking me?
Your personal view, yeah. You don't have to represent Joe Biden.
No, I can't. I won't speak for Joe Biden this morning, but I think that most Americans would have nothing but happiness if we had the opportunity to withdraw our forces from the Korean Peninsula, because the Korean Peninsula was at peace and North Korea was denuclearized. I believe also very strongly that the United States desperately wants peace on the peninsula. I know there are some theorists who have put forward an argument that the United States somehow wants a divided peninsula as an excuse to maintain our forces on the peninsula. I must strongly reject these arguments. There's no evidence for it. It's kind of a fear of American imperial ambition. I think that you can take from the election of Donald Trump a desire on the American people to reduce rather than enlarge our foreign entanglements. And I think that our forces are on the peninsula because they are deemed beneficial to maintaining peace and stability on the peninsula by the people of the Republic of Korea. And the moment that the people of the Republic of Korea ask us to leave, we'll be gone. So that's my long answer to a very important question. But I think absolutely the United States wants peace, and the United States would have no objection of any kind in withdrawing our forces from the peninsula if that was what was asked by the Republic of Korea in the context of making genuine peace on the Korean Peninsula.
Xietong, you are making very strange smile. Do you really buy Frank's argument? I personally believe that Frank is really saying out of his heart. But do you buy his argument? What is the Chinese perception of American behavior toward the Korean Peninsula these days? Now, Michael Pompeo declared the new Cold War and all these kinds of things. Do you really? But given that kind of posture, it is very unlikely that we can expect the idea of peace coming from Washington, D.C. Okay, now, Xietong, what is your take on that view?
From Frank's remarks, you find that he added a very crucial condition for getting American troops out of this area. It's the denuclearization of DPRK. Well, everyone knows that it's very difficult. And as long as the U.S. cannot reach any agreement with DPRK, I doubt DPRK will feel safe to denuclearize itself, because just now, like Mr. Lee mentioned, the history has illustrated, and like Libya, if you give up nuclear weapons, what a kind of result could be. So, from my understanding, at this moment, no matter who win the election, and the U.S. have not prepared to close its military base in South Korea, no matter what happens. And actually, even North Korea denuclearize its weapons, I doubt U.S. will get the troops out of that reason. I think there's only, that's my guess, only under one condition, and the U.S. may do that, is to have another trend that's the more extreme, get the troops out of the everywhere, get American troops back home from all over the world. So except you have the extreme trend, more extreme than the current trend. So actually, from my understanding, I do agree with Frank on one point, and also with Mr. Lee, that at this moment, we should consider substantial peace, how to reduce the tension between the North and the South. And for instance, and that's maybe as an outsider, I think it's unnecessary have some the anti-DPRK's activists to send the bloom into the North Korea. Well, what's the purpose? And how much you can influence North Korea's regime? I don't think that there's any influence except make the Kim Jong-un is more angry rather than to make a conciliation. So I think there's two things and ROK can do. First, consider to reduce some economic sanctions on the DPRK and shows you hospitality. And second, I don't think you can control this kind of anti-DPRK activities because you're a democracy. But then you can do something officially to not make this kind of anti-DPRK remarks. And if officially and this kind of hostile statement becomes less, that's also a way to improve the substance of the peaceful situation between the North and the South.
Xietong, I have a follow-up question to your remark. Suppose, whether it's President Trump or President Joe Biden, if they really pursue conflictual relations with China, then we'll be forced to take side with the United States. That being the case, then will China be assisting North Korea in terms of the military dimensions? Definitely, we are really talking about the advent of the new Cold War structure in Northeast Asia. On that situation, then will you be strengthening alliance tie with North Korea?
Okay. I think Yang Jiechi's visit to your country has clearly illustrated China's intention, how to deal with the situation in Korean Peninsula. And very important thing, we think the competition between China and the US will intensify. So we want to keep not your country, ROK, as neutral as possible. So in terms of to keep the ROK as neutral as possible, we certainly will encourage and the DPRK to improve the relationship with the ROK, because as long as these two states to improve the relationship, it's easier for China to keep ROK, your country, as neutral. If North Korea becomes a very hostile, the military confrontation between your two countries increases dramatically. It's difficult for China to keep ROK neutral. So you see, Yang Jiechi visited the South Korea, visited the Myanmar, the Greece, Spain, and also the Singapore. The same purpose, try to keep this country, we do not expect you stand at our side, but we hope you do not side with the US.
Okay,
so
Frank.
From our own interest, we will encourage North Korea to have a peace treaty with you.
Okay, Frank, two finger. Yes, Frank.
Very, very briefly, I'm very glad to hear my old friend Yan Xietong pledge that China is going to continue to push the DPRK to improve relations with South Korea for China's own interests. And I want to say that I think the same is true with respect to the United States, encouraging South Korea to improve relations with North Korea for our own interests, because the last thing the United States wants is a Cold War in Asia. It would be disastrous. And I know I've heard Secretary Pompeo, but I don't believe that he's speaking sense. To me, if South Korea is improving relations with North Korea, it means that the US and South Korean alliance will remain strong. If South Korea perceives that the United States is an obstacle to peace, rather than an instrument for peace on the Korean Peninsula, that will be the day that marks the end of the US-ROK alliance.
Professor Lopez, do you buy Frank's argument? He seems too generous. The United States has been, particularly Trump administration, has been blocking our venture into North Korea to improve inter-Korean relations. And plus, you emphasized the importance of unilateral concession from the American government. Would it be possible?
I think in order to have the best prospects for the kind of unilateral leadership that I've suggested, you have to have a situation in which first you stop singularly treating the nations in Northeast Asia as only bilateral relationships. That's the first one. In terms of agreeing with Frank, I think my only disagreement is that this administration in Washington has made the denuclearization and the bilateral relationship with Pyongyang as the highest priority order and doesn't see the complexity that exists on both the peninsula and in the region. You can't run a trade war against China and expect to have cooperative security relationships in the region that might change or lead to dialogue with North Korea. You can't unilaterally make decisions with regard to either U.S. finances with the ROK or our relationship with Japan without a central focus on the way that these parts relate to one another. So at the risk of being oversimplified about this, I believe that we need a less simplistic foreign policy coming out of Washington that understands the deep commitment that the United States must make to each individual state within a regional context, and particularly the even deeper commitment to peace on the peninsula between the two Koreas.
But I think here, we see one of the major problems coming from Washington, D.C. That is what? American position, particularly John Bolton's memoir, illustrated par excellence. That is what? North Korea, you denuclearize first, then we'll promise the bright future of your economy. In other words, denuclearization first, reward later. But I think even Joe Biden administration would retain the kind of approach. What is your take on that one? Maybe Frank and Professor Lopez.
Briefly, you've really put your finger on something very important, Chung-In, which is that to me, one of the signature failures of U.S. diplomacy with North Korea dating back to 1994 is the elevation of denuclearization to a religion as if it were the only objective on the Korean Peninsula. Denuclearization is only a priority because we're at war and because we have no trust. And any successful U.S. diplomacy has to be comprehensive, has to address the North Korean perspectives, including, as was pointed out earlier, that they feel threatened, and has to bring about a real peace on the peninsula. So we shouldn't, the U.S. fixation with denuclearization as if it were the only objective of American diplomacy is something that has been, I believe, at the core of why that diplomacy has failed. The six-party talks envisioned a more comprehensive process that was wisdom to try to look at trade and peace and North-South relations. And that's the only kind of process that makes sense.
Professor Lopez.
And if I might, yes. And the dilemma of the failure of high-level summit diplomacy on the one hand and maximum pressure sanctions on the other is that we have now catapulted this in U.S. circles to a domestic dispute among foreign policy visions in the United States, where Frank is exactly right. For some, the only way to deal with the peninsula is with regard to the DPRK nuclearization problem and its growing success. And for a more silent minority of others, it has to do with going back to thinking like the agreed frameworks and the time of the 90s where we were much closer to this. And that's all related to the catapulting of nuclear issues. we get along somehow with Pakistan in the United States, which seldom operates according to our interests in a variety of other areas, which has the nuclear capabilities, which has a trigger mechanism to generate war on the South Asia subcontinent, but somehow we seem to be able to do this. But we put North Korea in a particularly different class of irresponsibility and illogic that we ourselves have twisted ourselves into a foreign policy pretzel that's very dysfunctional, both for the U.S. and certainly for our allies in the region.
우리 김한정 의원께 제가 하나 질문이 있는데요.
I have a question to Assemblyman Lawmaker Kim. You're saying that even if we have an end of war declaration, that the USFK, because of the Mutual Defense Treaty that is in place, that USFK should not be part of that. But what about the UN command? Should they be included in the fold of the end of war declaration? Because the UN command is effectively there to carry out the armistice agreements. But in our transition over to a peace agreement, what's going to happen to the UN command?
Well, that would not be an issue for now, but that's a very tricky issue indeed. Of course, we shouldn't blow this issue out of proportion because UN command, that was a heritage or byproduct of the Korean War because we're still technically at war. UNC still remains in its place, and of course, we would have to change the structure of the regime if there's an official end to the war. So maybe a new form of promoting peace or guaranteeing peace on the Korean Peninsula would be the right direction forward. That is the spirit of the End the War Declaration. That is a pathway towards the peace agreement. I do not believe that UNC is going to be a fundamental obstacle to the pathway. There are some conservative arguments against that, however, because you're looking at the North Korea's threat to security and also the provocations as well as the opposition to denuclearization. And those issues still remain. And the UN command is seen as a political and diplomatic deterrence. Of course, we don't have to unarm ourselves before other party does it. But all in the end, everything has to be taken into consideration altogether. And in terms of peace building and peace promotion on the Korean Peninsula, UNC could be realigned so that it can make a positive contribution to that peace on the Korean Peninsula. We need to have a long-term horizon indeed.
Minister Lee, former Minister Lee, what do you think about this issue? Well, about the UN command, yes, I believe that it wasn't a direct outcome of the Korean War, and that is why they're still here. If the armistice agreement will transition to a peace agreement, although the end of war declaration is not necessarily a peace agreement, I don't think that the signing of an end of war declaration would directly, immediately mean that the UN command has to leave. But if we transition over to a peace agreement, I think that the UN's role would come to an end effectively because on the Korean Peninsula, North Korea and South Korea both members of the UN. So having UN command there, even after we've had a peace agreement, would not make sense logically or realistically. And I don't think that is going to help the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. I think that I have to say I really agreed with what Frank said in his comments. In the U.S. DPRK policy, they said they thought that denuclearization is the end-all, be-all of all of their different policies. That was their mistaken belief. And this mistaken belief, which was unilaterally sort of applied to Korean Peninsula and applied to ROK policies, I think was a mistake. I think that there needs to be a more of a comprehensive approach that the U.S. needs to take against DPRK. Now, that is very important, and I really hope that those comprehensive DPRK policies would come, and I do ask for your efforts in that regard. I think that right now, the ROK, the DPRK, you've mentioned John Bolton's memoir, but his memoir also said that President Moon Jae-in is really focused on unification. He sees the Korean Peninsula issue as one of unification. But when the Korean people talk about unification, it's not they don't want unification right away, where we unify immediately with North Korea. But when the Korean people say unification, the way they understand it is peace process. the way they express it is unification. But unification for most Koreans means that they're going towards peace process. So we're not thinking that immediately next day we're going to unify with North Korea, but that we are going towards a peace process. And I really hope that the U.S. can see that and embrace that so that they can see that the ROK people's approach towards the unification and towards DPRK is like this. And I hope that America can see that.
A question to you. Our current Minister of Unification, Han-jung, made a very interesting statement. The ROK-US alliance should be an alliance for peace, not for the old Cold War, the alliance for the old Cold War in a period. The State Department made a very critical comment on that one. What's wrong with his statement for alliance for peace? Anything wrong with his wording of 평화동맹, alliance for peace?
I don't see anything wrong with it at all. Prime Minister Abe came to the floor of the U.S. Congress and declared the U.S.-Japan alliance to be an alliance of hope. Why can't the U.S.-ROK alliance be an alliance of peace? No one is going to overlook the existence of a nuclear-armed North Korea that poses a threat today to the Republic of Korea, to U.S. national security. No one's going to ignore that just because our alliance is one which has hopefully the ambition to promote peace and stability, not just on the Korean Peninsula, but working around the world. Alliances don't always, deploy military tools. The U.S.-ROK partnership is one which already has worked together around the world, both in conflict zones and in disaster relief and development and economic development. I would welcome a vision of our alliance that can, over time, reprioritize from peace on the peninsula, where we have a direct challenge, to working together globally on common interests. And if the alliance gets to that point, it will probably be an alliance that doesn't have U.S. forces on the peninsula. And guess what? Alliances can endure even when you don't have troops stationed on each other's soil. I don't know whether China thinks that peace on the peninsula will end the U.S.-ROK alliance. I think it probably won't, but I think it will change that alliance, change the priorities, and also change the way in which we manifest the alliance in terms of force structure.
오늘 대단히 감사합니다. 오늘 상당히 솔직한 의견들 많이 주셨고요. 오늘 지금
Thank you very much. If I were to just very briefly summarize the findings of today's session, is that we have to take a look at the peace process as really that of a process where we ease tensions, build confidence, and declare an end of war, and a transition from an armistice agreement to a peace agreement so that we can build a peace regime of the Korean Peninsula or a peace system of the Korean Peninsula. I think that we have to see this as a long process, and it's obviously not going to be easy. It will take a lot of time, and it will be steeped in different difficulties and challenges. Former Minister Lee has stated that in creating peace, it is the two Koreas who have to take agency and who have to really be the key interested stakeholders involved. So I hope that when it comes to the end of war declaration, and the joint declaration, the October 4 declaration, the joint statement of September 19, all of those different agreements that were made have to be properly implemented. And thirdly, U.S.-China relations are obviously very important. U.S. and China are locked into what many people are calling a new Cold War regime. The Korean people do not want that. Korean Peninsula does not want that. That will only exacerbate tension, and that will only lead to a heightened possibility of war. So the Korean people do not want that. So that the many people on both the U.S. and China side really should work hard to dispel this new Cold War and to usher in stability and ultimate peace for Korean Peninsula and the region. Lastly, Dr. Frank Jannuzi has said some great words in that this peace alliance, an alliance for peace, would have much significance Because right now, starting from Afghanistan and Iraq, the Koreans have sent the Korean army to those regions. So I think that the Expression Peace Alliance is really good. So I don't know why the State Department said that. I think that Minister Lee In-young might be a little bit mistaken in that regard, but I would like to say that we'll conclude the session now.
Professor Lopez, Xietong, Frank, see you soon on FACE.
See you soon.